There are secrets buried in southern soil that no historian dares to excavate. In the affluent neighborhoods of antebellum Atlanta, between Peachtree Street and the slave markets near Decatur, 17 plantation families collapsed within 8 months of 1850. Not from disease, not from financial ruin, not from war. They disintegrated from within, torn apart by jealousy, violence, and obsession, all centered around one man who should have been invisible. His name was listed in auction records as property number 447, described only as male, approximately 23 years, exceptionally comely housed. Oh, what those records didn't mention was how his presence could transform rational men into fools and respectable women into criminals. City officials buried the reports. Churches refused to speak of it. Even newspapers that documented every scandal avoided printing his name. Before we continue with the story of the man who became Atlanta's most dangerous secret, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and comment below what state or city you're listening from. This story needs to be heard, and I want to know where truth seekers like you are watching from. Now, let's uncover what Atlanta tried to forget. The truth is, what happened in those 8 months wasn't documented because no one could explain it without admitting the hypocrisy at the heart of Southern society. Atlanta in 1850 stood at a crossroads of the American South, a city growing rapidly from railroad money and cotton wealth. The Western and Atlantic Railroad had transformed a small settlement into a bustling commercial center where fortunes were made overnight and reputations could be lost just as quickly. The city's elite lived in grand homes along Whitehall Street and Marietta Road, their prosperity built on the labor of enslaved people who remained deliberately invisible in polite society. The spring of 1850 brought unusual humidity to the city. Magnolia trees bloomed early, their heavy perfume mixing with the smoke from the railroad yards and the ever-present smell of red clay dust. In the affluent district, known as Quality Hill, where the most prominent families resided, there existed an unspoken competition among the wives and daughters. They competed in everything: the grandeur of their homes, the elegance of their gardens, the sophistication of their dinner parties, and most importantly, the refinement of their household staff. Among these families, the Hawthornes stood at the pinnacle of Atlanta society. Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne, a man of 52 with silver hair and an imposing presence, served on the Georgia Superior Court and owned 3 cotton plantations in the surrounding counties. His wife, Constance, had been raised in Charleston and never let anyone forget her aristocratic lineage. Their daughter Margaret, 20 years old and considered the most eligible young woman in Atlanta, was engaged to Robert Cunningham, the son of a shipping magnate. It was Constance Hawthorne who made the purchase that would unravel everything. She attended the spring auction at the market near Decatur Street, accompanied by her personal maid, a transaction she normally delegated to her husband's overseer. But she'd heard rumors about a particular lot arriving from a failed estate in Savannah, and curiosity compelled her to see for herself. The auction house was crowded that morning, filled with plantation owners, speculators, and domestic buyers. The air inside was stifling, thick with body heat and the smell of fear. Constance positioned herself near the front, her fan moving constantly, her face a mask of aristocratic indifference. When property number 447 was brought to the platform, the room fell silent. Even the auctioneer, a gruff man named Horace Fletcher, who'd conducted hundreds of such sales, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The young man who stood on the platform possessed features that seemed almost sculpted, with high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes of an unusual light brown that caught the morning light streaming through the high windows. His skin was the color of honey, suggesting mixed ancestry, and his bearing, despite the chains on his wrists, held an unconscious dignity that seemed wholly out of place. House trade, Fletcher announced, recovering his professional demeanor. Literate, trained in service at the Beaumont estate. No history of rebellion or flight. Starting bid at $800. The bidding began immediately and escalated rapidly. Constance found herself competing against 3 other buyers, including Rebecca Sutherland, her closest rival in social matters. The price climbed past $2,200, then $1,500, then $1,500. When it reached $2,000, an extraordinary sum for a male house servant, only Constance and Rebecca remained. At $2,300, Rebecca's husband placed a restraining hand on her arm. She subsided with obvious reluctance, her face flushed with frustration and something else Constance couldn't quite name. "Sold to Mrs. Hawthorne," Fletcher declared, bringing down his gavel. As Constance completed the paperwork, Rebecca approached her with a tight smile. "You've made quite an investment, Constance. I do hope he proves worth the expense." I'm certain he will, Constance replied, though she felt oddly unsettled by her own impulsiveness. She'd paid nearly twice what she'd intended, driven by something she couldn't quite articulate. The young man, she learned his name, was listed as Gabriel in the estate records, was delivered to the Hawthorne residence that afternoon. Judge Hawthorne barely glanced at him, nodding his approval at his wife's choice before returning to his study. The household staff, however, reacted differently. Martha, the head cook, who'd been with the Hawthorns for 20 years, took one look at Gabriel and crossed herself. A gesture from her Catholic childhood that she rarely displayed. That one's trouble, she muttered to anyone who would listen. Beautiful things always are. She was right, though not in any way she could have predicted. Gabriel's first weeks in the Hawthorne household passed with deceptive calm. He was assigned to serve at dinner and assist with receiving guests, tasks he performed with quiet efficiency. Judge Hawthorne praised his bearing. Constance congratulated herself on her excellent judgment. Margaret found excuses to request his presence more frequently than necessary. The first sign of trouble came in late May when Rebecca Sutherland appeared at the Hawthorne residence unannounced, something she'd never done before. She claimed to need Constance's advice on planning a charity benefit, but her eyes kept drifting to Gabriel as he served tea in the parlor. You must allow me to borrow him for my garden party next week, Rebecca said, her voice carrying an unusual intensity. I simply must have the best presentation, and clearly you've acquired the finest servant in Atlanta. Constance felt an immediate and irrational refusal rise in her throat. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Gabriel is still learning our household routines. Rebecca's smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course, how thoughtless of me to ask, but she visited 3 more times that week, each time with increasingly transparent excuses. The situation escalated in June, when Caroline Pembroke, a wealthy widow known for her respectable demeanor and charitable works, called on the Hawthorns. Unlike Rebecca's barely concealed fascination, Caroline's approach was more subtle. She engaged Gabriel in conversation while he served, asking about his education, his experiences, his thoughts on literature. Her interest seemed intellectual, almost maternal, but there was something desperate in the way she manufactured reasons to visit. I've never met a servant who could discuss Shakespeare, she told Constance over tea. Where did you say he received his education? The Beaumont estate had a rather unusual approach to their household staff. Constance replied carefully, though she knew little of Gabriel's actual history. That night, Judge Hawthorne mentioned casually that Caroline Pembroke had approached him at the courthouse, offering to purchase Gabriel for $3,000, $500 more than Constance had paid. I told her he wasn't for sale, of course, the judge said, puzzled. Odd behavior from such a sensible woman. It was Margaret who first articulated what no one wanted to acknowledge. She cornered her mother in the morning room, her face flushed with anger and confusion. Every woman who visits this house is here to see him. Mother, they pretend it's social calls, but they can barely tear their eyes away. It's unseemly. It's obscene. Constance wanted to deny it, but she'd noticed the same thing. More troubling, she'd noticed her own behavior changing. She found herself requesting Gabriel's presence for tasks that could have been performed by other servants. She'd caught herself studying his face when she thought no one was watching, cataloging the precise curve of his jawline, the way light caught in his eyes. It's his appearance, Constance said weakly. Some people have unusually handsome features. It means nothing. But she was wrong. It meant everything. By July, the situation had become impossible to ignore. The Hawthorne residence received more visitors in 6 weeks than in the previous 6 months. Women who'd never been particularly friendly with Constance suddenly became devoted callers. Tea parties were scheduled with unusual frequency. Even women from prominent families who normally avoided socializing with those they considered beneath their station found reasons to visit. Judge Hawthorne grew increasingly irritated by the constant traffic through his home. This house has become a salon, he complained. What's causing this sudden popularity? Constance couldn't tell him. How could she explain that Atlanta's most respectable women were behaving like schoolgirls all over a servant? How could she admit that she understood their fascination because she felt it herself? The real crisis began on a Thursday evening in late July when the Hawthorns hosted a dinner party for 12 guests. Gabriel served alongside 2 other house servants, moving efficiently between the table and the kitchen. Constance noticed several women watching him with undisguised interest, but one guest's behavior stood out. Elizabeth Crane, wife of a prominent banker, could barely focus on conversation. Her eyes followed Gabriel constantly, her food largely untouched. During the dessert course, Elizabeth excused herself, claiming she needed air. 15 minutes passed. When Constance went to check on her, she found Elizabeth in the hallway near the servants' quarters, her face red, breathing hard, blocking Gabriel's path back to the kitchen. "Mrs. Crane," Constance said sharply, "are you unwell?" Elizabeth turned, her expression wild, desperate. I was looking for the powder room in the servants' hall. How unusual!" The next morning, Elizabeth's husband appeared at the Hawthorne residence, his face rigid with humiliation. "My wife has confessed something deeply disturbing," he said to Judge Hawthorne in the privacy of his study. She claims your servant has been making improper advances toward her." Judge Hawthorne summoned Gabriel immediately. The young man stood before them, his face calm but wary. "Sir, I've made no advances toward anyone. I've performed my duties with propriety." "My wife insists otherwise," Crane said, his voice shaking. "She's prepared to make a formal complaint." The judge's face darkened. "Mr. Crane, I find it curious that your wife would make such an accusation, given that she was found lurking in my servants' quarters last night. My wife witnessed the entire incident." Crane's anger deflated into shame. "Elizabeth has been unwell lately. Perhaps we should forget this matter." But the matter couldn't be forgotten because Elizabeth Crane wasn't the only woman whose behavior had become erratic. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Atlanta intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The incident with Elizabeth Crane should have been a warning, but instead it accelerated the madness. Within days, 2 more women from prominent families approached Judge Hawthorne with offers to purchase Gabriel, each offer higher than the last. The judge refused all of them, growing increasingly disturbed by the pattern. "Something isn't right," he told Constance. "These are respectable women, wives and mothers, behaving like I don't even know what to call it." Constance knew exactly what to call it, but saying it aloud would mean admitting her own growing obsession. She'd begun waking in the middle of the night, her thoughts consumed with Gabriel's presence in her household. She found excuses to be near him, to hear his voice, to watch the way he moved. The rational part of her mind recognized the insanity of it, but rationality seemed powerless against whatever force had taken hold. Martha the cook became increasingly vocal about her concerns. "That boy needs to go," she told Constance bluntly. "He's got some kind of hold on folks, and it ain't natural." "Don't be superstitious," Constance snapped, though she'd been thinking similar thoughts. "He's done nothing wrong. Maybe not on purpose," Martha conceded, "but wrong's being done all the same. You've seen how Miss Margaret looks at him. How every woman who comes through that door can't keep her eyes off him. This house is headed for ruin, ma'am, and you know it." Margaret's engagement to Robert Cunningham collapsed in August. Robert came to the Hawthorne residence to find his fiancée sitting in the garden, ostensibly reading but actually watching Gabriel as he trimmed the roses. The expression on her face, raw and desperate and entirely inappropriate, told Robert everything he needed to know. "I won't marry into a household that's become the subject of gossip," Robert said coldly. "Half of Atlanta is talking about your family's peculiar servant. Margaret didn't even fight for her engagement." She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving Gabriel's figure in the garden. Judge Hawthorne finally acknowledged the crisis. He called Constance and Margaret into his study, his face grave. "I'm going to sell him tomorrow. I'll take a loss on the price if necessary, but this situation has become intolerable." Constance felt something collapse inside her chest. "You can't." "I can, and I will. This household has become a circus. Our reputation is suffering. Margaret's engagement is broken. Women I've known for years are behaving like lunatics, all because of one servant. He's done nothing wrong." Constance heard herself saying, "He's been perfectly proper." "That's exactly the problem," the judge said quietly. "He does nothing and yet everything falls apart around him." But selling Gabriel proved impossible, because by morning the situation had spiraled into violence. The first attack came just before dawn. Samuel Winters, a wealthy merchant whose wife had been among the Hawthorns' frequent recent visitors, forced his way into the servants' quarters with a loaded pistol. He was found by other servants, standing over Gabriel's bed, gun shaking in his hand, weeping. "She dreams about him." Winters sobbed as Judge Hawthorne and the city constable arrived. "Every night she says his name in her sleep. My wife of 20 years has become a stranger." Gabriel hadn't been harmed, but the incident sent shockwaves through Atlanta's elite community. The constable, Tom Bridger, a practical man who'd seen his share of domestic disputes, found himself baffled by the case. "I can't arrest a man for sleeping in his own bed," he told Judge Hawthorne. "But Winters isn't wrong about the effect this servant is having on people." Bridger began investigating, interviewing servants from various households, trying to understand what he was dealing with. What he discovered made him deeply uncomfortable. Every family that's had extended contact with your servant has experienced disruption. Bridger reported the Pendletons. Their daughter ran away from home last week, left a note saying she couldn't bear to marry her intended when her heart belonged to someone impossible. The Ashtons. Mrs. Ashton attempted to visit your residence 12 times in 2 weeks. Her husband has her under watch now. Thinks she's lost her mind. The Merriweathers, their marriage is collapsing and both husband and wife blame each other for being too familiar with your household. This is insanity, Judge Hawthorne said. One servant cannot destroy a dozen families. And yet he has, Bridger replied. Whether he intends to or not, whether he's done anything improper or not, the result is the same. People lose their reason around him. The judge made a decision. "I'll send him away to my plantation in Clark County. He can work in the fields there, away from the city." But before arrangements could be made, the situation escalated beyond anyone's control. Rebecca Sutherland, who'd competed with Constance for Gabriel at the auction, broke into the Hawthorne residence on a Wednesday night in mid-August. She was discovered by Martha in the servants' quarters holding a knife, standing over a sleeping Gabriel. "I was going to scar him," Rebecca said calmly when the constable arrived. "If I couldn't have him, and if no one else could bear to look away from him, then the solution seemed obvious. Make him ugly. Make him normal." She was taken into custody, but her husband, prominent attorney James Sutherland, had her quietly committed to a private asylum in Millettville before the scandal could become public. The official story was that Rebecca had suffered a nervous breakdown from the summer heat, but the violence didn't stop. 3 nights later, someone set fire to the Hawthorne stables. The blaze was discovered early enough to save the horses, but the building was destroyed. No perpetrator was identified, though a note was found nearby. Remove the curse from Atlanta. Judge Hawthorne hired additional security. Gabriel was confined to the house, no longer allowed to be seen by visitors, but confining him only made things worse, because now the women who'd been obsessing over him had no outlet for their fixation. Their desperation intensified. Caroline Pembroke, the respectable widow who'd seemed so intellectual in her interest, appeared at the Hawthorne residence at midnight, pounding on the door, demanding to see Gabriel just once more. She was disheveled, her hair unpinned, her dress rumpled, looking nothing like the composed woman she'd been 2 months earlier. "Please," she begged Constance. "I know it's madness. I know it makes no sense, but I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can think of nothing else. Just let me see him for a moment. Speak to him, and perhaps this fever will break." Constance recognized the symptoms because she was experiencing them herself. The rational part of her mind understood that her feelings were disproportionate, possibly even delusional, but rationality offered no defense against the compulsion that had taken root in her thoughts. "You need to go home, Caroline," Constance said, though what she wanted to do was confess that she understood completely. Caroline left, but she wasn't the last midnight visitor. Over the following week, 4 different women appeared at various hours, all with similar pleas, all exhibiting the same desperate fixation. Judge Hawthorne finally contacted Dr. Benjamin Hayes, a physician who specialized in disorders of the mind. Hayes listened to the judge's account with growing fascination and concern. "What you're describing sounds like a form of collective hysteria," he said. "I've read accounts of similar phenomena in Europe, entire communities becoming fixated on an individual or an object, but I've never encountered it myself." "Can you examine him?" the judge asked. "Determine if there's something wrong with him." Hayes interviewed Gabriel extensively. He examined him physically. He tested his mental faculties, his emotional responses, his understanding of social situations. His conclusion was both reassuring and deeply troubling. "There's nothing wrong with him," Hayes reported. "He's intelligent, well-spoken, emotionally stable. He seems genuinely distressed by the situation but claims to have done nothing to provoke it. I believe him. Whatever is causing this mass reaction, it's not coming from him consciously." "Then what is causing it?" Judge Hawthorne demanded. Hayes hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "In my professional opinion, what we're witnessing is a convergence of factors: societal repression, forbidden desires, the particular circumstances of Southern life, all focused on an individual who represents something unattainable. These women, and I suspect some men as well, though they're better at hiding it, are reacting to him as a symbol rather than as a person. A symbol of what? Of everything they cannot have, cannot acknowledge, cannot speak about in polite society. His existence challenges certain assumptions that your social structure depends upon, that he's both accessible living in these houses and simultaneously forbidden by law and custom, creates an impossible tension. Add to that his unusual physical appearance and you have a perfect storm of psychological disruption. The doctor's explanation made intellectual sense, but it offered no practical solution. Gabriel couldn't change his appearance. The social structures of the South weren't going to transform overnight, and the women of Atlanta couldn't simply will away their obsessions. "What do you recommend?" Judge Hawthorne asked. "Remove him from Atlanta," Hayes said bluntly. "Send him as far away as possible. It's the only way this will end without more violence." But before the judge could act on this advice, Margaret disappeared. Margaret vanished on a Thursday morning in late August. Her bed hadn't been slept in. Her clothes were gone. A note on her pillow read simply, "I've gone where I can breathe freely. Don't follow me." Constance found the note and immediately knew where her daughter had gone. She ran to the servants' quarters, her heart pounding, and discovered Gabriel was also missing. The implications were catastrophic. A white woman of good family fleeing with an enslaved man. It was the South's greatest nightmare, the ultimate transgression. If discovered, it would mean death for Gabriel and social destruction for Margaret and the entire Hawthorne family. Judge Hawthorne organized a quiet search party, men he trusted to be discreet. Constable Bridger led the effort, following the limited clues available. Witnesses reported seeing a well-dressed young woman boarding a northbound train at the Marietta Depot the previous evening, accompanied by a man whose face was hidden by a hat and scarf. "They're heading for Chattanooga," Bridger concluded. "From there, probably trying to reach the Ohio River and cross into free territory." The hunt that followed consumed the next 3 days. Bridger and his men tracked the fugitives north through Georgia, following sightings and rumors. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, the Hawthornes struggled to maintain appearances, claiming Margaret was visiting relatives in Charleston. But secrets that explosive don't stay contained. Whispers began circulating through the city. The women who'd been obsessed with Gabriel now reacted with fury and betrayal, as if Margaret had stolen something that belonged to them. Anonymous notes began arriving at the Hawthorne residence, some threatening, others pleading for information about Gabriel's whereabouts. Judge Hawthorne aged a decade in 3 days. "If they catch them together," he told Constance, his voice hollow, "the law is clear. They'll hang him, possibly without trial. And Margaret, our daughter, will be ruined, possibly institutionalized. Every family we know will shun us." Constance felt as if she were drowning. Part of her wanted Margaret found and brought home safely regardless of the scandal, but another part, the part that had been consuming her for months, felt a twisted admiration for her daughter's boldness in acting, on feelings that Constance had only allowed herself to experience in secret. The search party finally caught up to Margaret and Gabriel in a small town outside Dalton, just 30 miles from the Tennessee border. But what they found wasn't what anyone expected. Margaret was alone in a boarding house room, feverish and delirious. Gabriel was nowhere to be found. "He left me," Margaret told her father when she regained enough coherence to speak. "The second night of our journey, he disappeared. I woke up and he was gone. He left money for my return and a note." "What did the note say?" Judge Hawthorne asked. Margaret's face crumpled. That I deserved better than to throw my life away on an impossible dream. That he'd never asked for my devotion or anyone else's. That he was sorry for the pain his existence had caused, but he couldn't fix it by running away with me. He said I wasn't in love with him. I was in love with the idea of transgression, of rebellion, of choosing something forbidden. He saw right through me, Father. He understood my feelings better than I did." Constance felt something crack open inside her chest. Because Gabriel was right. She recognized the truth of his words in her own obsession. She hadn't been in love with Gabriel, the person. She knew almost nothing about him as an individual. She'd been in love with what he represented. Youth, beauty, forbidden desire, a chance to feel something intense in a life that had become numbingly predictable. Margaret was brought home quietly, The official story was that she'd been visiting a sick friend and had fallen ill herself. Most of Atlanta's elite pretended to believe it, though the knowing looks and whispered conversations continued for weeks. But the question remained, where was Gabriel? Gabriel resurfaced in Atlanta 3 weeks later, but not in the way anyone anticipated. Constable Bridger received a message from the slave patrols in Clayton County. A young man matching Gabriel's description had turned himself in at a plantation there requesting to be sold to the farthest location possible. He wants to be sent west, Bridger told Judge Hawthorne, to Texas or Arkansas, anywhere he can't cause more damage. The judge arranged to meet Gabriel one final time in Bridger's office, away from the Hawthorne residence. Constance insisted on accompanying him, and he didn't have the energy to refuse her. Gabriel looked thinner, older somehow, though only a few weeks had passed. He stood before them with quiet dignity, his hands folded, his eyes steady. "Why did you come back?" Judge Hawthorne asked. "You could have kept running, reached free territory." "Running doesn't solve anything," Gabriel replied. "The problem isn't where I am, it's what I represent to people. That doesn't change in Ohio or Canada." And leaving Atlanta in chaos, with families destroyed, women's reputations ruined, violence erupting. "I couldn't live with that. You could have avoided all of this by simply being less." Constance struggled for words, less noticeable. Gabriel's laugh was bitter. "You think I chose this? You think I wanted any of this attention? I tried to be invisible, Mrs. Hawthorne. I performed my duties quietly. I avoided unnecessary conversation. I made myself as unremarkable as possible, but it didn't matter because the attention was never really about me. It was about what people projected onto me." "What do you mean?" Judge Hawthorne asked. Gabriel chose his words carefully. "I learned to read at the Beaumont estate because Mrs. Beaumont believed education would make her household staff more efficient. She taught several of us. One book I read was about Greek myths, stories about mortals who were cursed by the gods to be irresistibly beautiful. Those stories always ended in tragedy, not because the beautiful person did anything wrong, but because people couldn't control their reactions to them. I used to think those stories were metaphors. Now I know they were warnings." He paused, his expression pained. "These women in Atlanta, they don't see me as a person. They see a fantasy, a symbol of forbidden desire, a way to feel alive in lives that society has made suffocating. Mrs. Prohl, Sutherland wanted to scar me because she understood that if I was ugly, I'd become human again, just another servant. But being beautiful in the wrong context, in a place where I'm simultaneously visible and forbidden, it makes me a target for every repressed feeling, every unspoken desire, every rebellion that can't be named." Constance felt tears on her face. He was right. She'd never thought about his preferences, his desires, his humanity. She'd been so consumed with her own feelings that she'd never considered what it must be like to be the object of such unwanted obsession. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We treated you like a possession, not a person." "You purchased me at an auction, Mom," Gabriel said quietly. "That's what I am in the eyes of the law, a possession. The tragedy isn't that you treated me as one. It's that my existence challenged that definition in ways no one knew how to handle." Judge Hawthorne cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "I've arranged for your sale to a cotton plantation in Polk County in the northwest part of the state. It's remote, far from Atlanta. You'll work in the fields there, away from situations like this." Before Gabriel could respond, the door to Bridger's office burst open. Martha, the Hawthorne's cook, stood in the doorway, breathing hard from running. "Judge, you need to come quickly. Miss Margaret has locked herself in her room, and she's saying terrible things about not wanting to live if she stopped abruptly seeing Gabriel." The judge's face went pale. "Constable, keep him here. I'll return within the hour." He rushed out with Martha, leaving Constance alone with Gabriel and Bridger. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Bridger busied himself with paperwork, trying to give them privacy while maintaining his duty to watch Gabriel. Constance found herself studying Gabriel's face, trying to see past the beauty that had caused so much destruction, trying to find the person underneath. "May I ask you something?" she said finally. "In all of this chaos, all these women obsessing over you, did any of them ever simply ask you about yourself? Your thoughts, your hopes, what you wanted from life?" Gabriel met her eyes. "Mrs. Dame." Pembroke came closest. "She asked about books I'd read, ideas I had about philosophy. For a moment I thought she saw me as a thinking person, but then I realized she was collecting pieces of me like curiosities, things that made me more interesting to fantasize about. She didn't want to know me. She wanted to possess an exotic conversation partner. And Margaret, my daughter, Gabriel's expression softened slightly. Miss Margaret is young. She mistook rebellion for love, transgression for genuine feeling. When we were traveling, she talked constantly about the life we'd build together, the scandal we'd cause, how romantic it would be. She never once asked me if I wanted any of that. She was writing her own story, and I was just a character in it, not a collaborator. Why did you leave her? Because I've seen where that story ends. I've heard of other cases, men like me who ran away with white women. They never make it far. They're caught, and the man is killed, sometimes burned alive or hanged without trial. The woman is institutionalized or hidden away in shame. I couldn't let Miss Margaret destroy her life for a fantasy. She deserves a real future, not martyrdom for a cause she doesn't truly understand. Constance wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. You're wiser than any of us gave you credit for. Survival requires wisdom, ma'am. People like me can't afford the luxury of foolishness. Judge Hawthorne returned 40 minutes later looking haggarded. Margaret had been sedated by Dr. Hayes and was now resting under careful watch. She'll recover, the judge said, though he didn't sound convinced. Hayes says it's a kind of fever that will pass with time and distance. He turned to Gabriel with an expression mixing regret and determination. The sale is arranged for tomorrow morning. You'll be transported under guard to Polk County. I've instructed the buyer to keep your presence discreet. No household service, strictly field work where you'll have minimal contact with anyone beyond other field hands. I understand, sir. There's one more matter, the judge continued. Several men in Atlanta are calling for harsher measures. They claim you've bewitched their wives, corrupted their daughters. Constable Bridger has arranged for you to be held in a secure location tonight, away from the jail where they might find you. Gabriel nodded acceptance of his fate, with a calmness that made Constance's heart ache. He was so young, perhaps 23 or 24, and yet he spoke and acted with the resignation of someone far older, someone who'd learned long ago that fighting against his circumstances was futile. One question, Bridger interjected. The Beaumont estate, where you came from originally. Why did they sell you? Gabriel's smile was sad. For the same reasons you're sending me away. I'd been at Beaumont for 3 years. The mistress who educated me died, and her daughters began competing for my attention. The master's wife became distant and cold to her husband. 2 engagements in the household were broken. The master sold me to avoid the same chaos that happened here and before Beaumont Bridger pressed. I was born on a plantation in South Carolina, sold when I was 14 because the overseer's wife developed an attachment. Before that, my mother tried to hide me, keep me from being noticed. She told me once that being beautiful was a curse for people like us, that it brought nothing but pain. I didn't understand then. I understand now. The room fell silent. The full scope of the tragedy became clear. Gabriel had been displaced repeatedly throughout his life, punished for an accident of birth that he had no control over, blamed for reactions he didn't provoke. What happened to your mother? Constance asked softly. She was sold when I was 11 to a different owner. I don't know where she is now. Gabriel's voice remained steady, but Constance saw the pain flash across his face. She tried to prepare me for what my life would be like. She said I should make myself invisible, never speak unless spoken to, never look anyone in the eye. But some things can't be hidden, Mrs. Hawthorne, and the invisibility she taught me only seemed to make people more curious when they finally noticed me. Judge Hawthorne looked away, his face troubled. For perhaps the first time, he was confronting the human cost of the system he'd spent his career upholding. I'll ensure the buyer in Polk County understands the situation. You'll be given work that keeps you isolated. A different kind of prison, Gabriel said quietly, but better than a noose. As Bridger prepared to move Gabriel to the secure location, Constance made an impulsive decision. Wait, I want to give him something. She removed a small leather-bound book from her bag, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets she'd been carrying. You spoke of reading at the Beaumont estate. Perhaps this will provide some comfort in Polk County. Gabriel accepted the book with genuine surprise. Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind. It's inadequate, Constance said, but it's something. The transfer was arranged for the following morning. Gabriel would be taken by armed escort to his new location, far from Atlanta, far from the chaos he'd unwittingly created. But that night, Atlanta's carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely. The violence came from an unexpected source, Thomas Pendleton, The father, whose daughter had run away rather than marry her intended, had been quietly descending into rage for weeks. He blamed Gabriel for his daughter's rebellion, for the disruption of his family, for the humiliation he'd endure. He'd been drinking steadily since the scandal broke, nursing his grievances, working himself into a fury. His daughter Sarah had been found 3 days after running away, working as a seamstress in Marietta under an assumed name. She'd refused to return home, refused to explain her actions beyond saying she couldn't marry a man she didn't love when she knew what real feeling looked like. The shame of having his daughter living independently, working for wages like a common laborer, had broken something in Pendleton. He arrived at the jail where Gabriel was supposedly being held overnight, carrying a shotgun, demanding that Constable Bridger turn over the creature who destroyed my family. Bridger informed him that Gabriel wasn't there, which only inflamed Pendleton's anger. "Where is he then?" Pendleton shouted, his words slurred. "Hiding like the coward he is." "He's in protective custody," Bridger said calmly, "and I suggest you go home and sleep off whatever you've been drinking." But Pendleton had already spread the word. By midnight, a group of angry men had gathered outside the jail, demanding justice for what they called the corruption of Atlanta's virtue. They carried torches and weapons, their faces twisted with righteous fury. Judge Hawthorne was summoned from his home. He arrived to find nearly 30 men blocking the street, with more arriving as word spread through the city's taverns and boarding houses. He recognized several faces, respected merchants, clerks, a Presbyterian minister, men who should have known better than to join a mob. "This is not justice," the judge told the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. "This is a mob acting on emotion rather than law." "The law protects property, not people," someone shouted back. "That creature is property that's caused damage. We have a right to compensation." "He's done nothing illegal," the judge countered. "No impropriety has been proven. No law has been broken. If you take action against him, you're the ones committing crimes." "What about our families?" Pendleton stepped forward, swaying slightly. "My daughter has ruined her reputation because of him. Elizabeth Crane nearly destroyed her marriage. Rebecca Sutherland is in an asylum. How many more families need to suffer before someone does something?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Judge Hawthorne could see the situation spiraling beyond his control. These weren't hardened criminals or violent men by nature. They were ordinary citizens driven to extremity by circumstances they didn't understand, looking for someone to blame for the chaos that had invaded their carefully ordered lives. "Your family suffered because of their own choices," the judge said, though he knew this argument would fall on deaf ears. "Gabriel committed no crime. He made no advances. He violated no trust. The problem isn't him. It's us and the system we've created that makes his mere existence into a crisis." Fancy words from a man whose own daughter ran away with him. Someone yelled, "How much did he pay you to protect him?" The accusation was absurd, but it found purchase in the crowd's inflamed mood. Judge Hawthorne felt his authority slipping away, replaced by the primitive dynamics of mob justice. Dr. Hayes arrived, having been alerted to the gathering by one of his patients. He pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his medical bag in hand. "Gentlemen, please listen to reason. I've examined the young man in question. There's nothing supernatural about him, nothing evil. What happened this summer was a form of collective hysteria, a psychological phenomenon I've read about in medical journals. Killing him won't undo the damage. It will only add murder to the list of transgressions Atlanta must answer for. Hysteria." Pendleton laughed bitterly. "My daughter abandoned her future for hysteria. My wife cries herself to sleep every night because of hysteria." "Yes," Hayes said bluntly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. Your daughter is young and impressionable, caught up in romantic notions of forbidden love. Your wife is grieving the loss of who she thought her daughter would become. Those are real pains, but they're not Gabriel's fault. He's as much a victim of this situation as anyone." "A victim?" Another voice rose from the crowd. "He lives in fine houses, eats good food, doesn't break his back in the fields. Some victim." Hayes tried to respond, but his words were drowned out by angry shouts. The crowd was growing larger and more agitated, feeding off each other's anger. Judge Hawthorne made a decision. He turned to Bridger and spoke quietly. "Get word to wherever Gabriel is hidden. Tell them to move him again now. Don't wait for morning." Bridger nodded and disappeared into the jail, emerging moments later from a back entrance. The crowd didn't notice his departure, too focused on their confrontation with the judge. The standoff lasted hours. Several of Atlanta's more level-headed citizens arrived as word spread. Ministers, business owners, even Judge Hawthorne's colleague from the bench, Judge Samuel Webster. They worked the crowd, pulling individuals aside, reasoning with them, pointing out that violence would only create more scandal, more problems, more shame for the city. Gradually, as the night wore on and sobriety began returning to some of the men, the crowd's energy dissipated. Pendleton was taken home by his brother, still muttering threats. The minister convinced several men that Christian principles demanded mercy, not vengeance. Others simply grew tired and cold as the temperature dropped. By dawn, only a handful remained, and these were dispersed by the arrival of a group of militia volunteers summoned by Judge Webster. The immediate crisis had passed, but everyone knew the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Gabriel had been moved to a farmhouse 15 miles outside Atlanta, owned by a Quaker family who occasionally helped fugitives reach free territory. The irony wasn't lost on Judge Hawthorne, using abolition sympathizers to protect a man who would be sold further into slavery, but desperate circumstances required unlikely alliances. The judge visited Gabriel there the next day, accompanied only by Constance. They found him sitting on the porch. The book of sonnets Constance had given him open in his lap. He looked up as they approached, and Constance was struck by how peaceful he seemed despite everything. "The sale has been complicated," Judge Hawthorne said without preamble. "The buyer in Polk County has withdrawn his offer, concerned about the attention Gabriel might attract, even in a remote location. I'm arranging transport to a plantation in Mississippi instead near Vicksburg. The owner there has experience with unusual situations." "What kind of experience?" Gabriel asked. The judge hesitated. He maintains several properties, including one where he sends enslaved workers who need to be kept separate from the general population for various reasons. Troublemakers, valuable artisans he wants protected, individuals with specialized skills. You'll be housed alone, given work that requires minimal interaction with others. Solitary confinement, Gabriel said. A life sentence of loneliness. "It's the best I can do," the judge said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "The alternative is to sell you at public auction, and after what's happened, I fear what some buyers might do with you. At least this arrangement offers safety." Gabriel closed the book carefully, running his fingers over the leather cover. "I appreciate your efforts, Judge Hawthorne. Truly, you didn't have to protect me. Many wouldn't have." "I'm not protecting you out of kindness," the judge said bluntly. "I'm protecting my city from its own worst impulses. If that mob had succeeded in finding you, Atlanta's reputation would have been destroyed. We would have become known as the place where civilized society broke down over a single servant." "And yet society did break down," Gabriel observed. "The mob, the hysteria, the destruction of families, that all happened regardless of what happens to me." The judge had no response to that truth. Constance spoke up. "What will you do in Mississippi? I mean, how will you survive years of isolation?" Gabriel held up the book. "I'll read. I'll think. I'll try to find some meaning in all of this." He paused. "And I'll hope that someday, somehow, this country finds a way to see people like me as human beings rather than property or symbols or walking catastrophes. That may take longer than either of us will live to see," the judge said quietly. "Perhaps. But hope costs nothing, and I have little else to sustain me." The transport to Mississippi was arranged through a series of private conveyances, avoiding public roads in towns where Gabriel might be recognized. Judge Hawthorne spared no expense, hiring armed guards and paying for discreet passage. It was the least he could do, and yet it felt profoundly inadequate. Before Gabriel departed, Constance asked for a private moment with him. The judge granted it reluctantly, standing watch at a distance. "I need to tell you something," Constance said, her voice low and urgent. "About my daughter, about all of us who became fixated on you. I've spent weeks trying to understand what happened to me, why I behaved so irrationally. Dr. Hayes called it hysteria, and perhaps he's right, but I think it was also something else." "What?" Gabriel asked gently. "Grief," Constance said. "Grief for the life I thought I wanted but never had. Grief for choices I made decades ago that I can't unmake. Grief for the person I might have been if society hadn't demanded I fit into such a narrow role. You represented possibility, Gabriel, not because of who you actually are, but because you existed outside the rules that constrain the rest of us. We projected our griefs, our longings, our frustrations onto you because you were there and you were beautiful and you were forbidden. It was never really about you at all." Gabriel nodded slowly. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me through all of this. Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne." "I'm sorry," Constance said. tears streaming down her face now for my selfishness, for my blindness, for being part of the system that's destroying your life. I wish I could do more than apologize. Your apology means more than you know, Gabriel said. Most people never acknowledge the humanity of those they've wronged. You have that something. They parted there, Constance watching as Gabriel was led to the covered wagon that would take him away from Atlanta forever. She stood beside her husband, both of them silent witnesses to the departure of the young man who had inadvertently exposed all their society's contradictions. The aftermath in Atlanta was profound, but largely unspoken. The city's newspapers, which had maintained their silence throughout the crisis, continued to avoid any mention of the events. But in private conversations, in whispered exchanges at church socials and ladies' tea parties, the story spread and morphed, becoming legend and cautionary tale. Rebecca Sutherland remained in the asylum in Milledgeville. Her husband visited monthly, hoping for improvement that never came. She spent her days painting portraits from memory, all of them variations of the same face, the same light brown eyes, the same expression of quiet dignity. The asylum doctors noted that she seemed content in her obsession, and perhaps that was the kindest outcome available to her. Elizabeth Crane's marriage survived, but was forever altered. Her husband never spoke of the incident directly, but the trust between them had been broken beyond repair. They maintained appearances for society, but servants reported that they lived essentially separate lives within the same house, communicating through notes and intermediaries. Elizabeth grew thin and pale, aging rapidly as if the passion that had briefly consumed her had burned away something essential. Caroline Pembroke did move to Savannah, where she opened a small school for girls. She never married, never spoke of Atlanta, and devoted herself entirely to education. Some said she was running from shame. Others thought she'd found a kind of redemption in teaching young women to think critically, to question the role society prescribed for them. The truth probably lay somewhere in between. Margaret Hawthorne's recovery took months. Dr. Hayes prescribed rest, routine, and absolutely no discussion of the summer's events. She was kept home, kept busy with domestic tasks, kept under careful watch. When she finally emerged from her seclusion, she seemed subdued, older, her youthful romanticism replaced by a harder, more pragmatic outlook. She did eventually marry, as Constance had told Gabriel. The man was Jonathan Price, a clerk in her father's law office, steady and unremarkable, and utterly devoted to her. It wasn't the grand match her parents had once envisioned, but it proved surprisingly solid. Margaret had learned that extraordinary passion leads to extraordinary destruction, and she chose safety instead. She bore 3 children and lived a quiet, respectable life. Only occasionally, late at night, did she allow herself to remember the summer when she'd felt truly alive, even if that feeling had been built on illusion. Judge Hawthorne's transformation was perhaps the most profound. He continued his work on the bench, but colleagues noticed a change in his rulings. He became more lenient in cases involving enslaved people, more willing to question the absolute property rights of owners, more troubled by the contradictions inherent in a system that treated human beings as cattle. He never spoke openly against slavery. That would have been social and professional suicide, but his private doubts grew deeper with each passing year. He and Constance grew closer through the crisis, their relationship deepening in unexpected ways. They'd been partners for decades, but the events of 1850 forced them to truly see each other, to acknowledge their own capacity for irrationality and obsession. They became more honest with each other, more willing to discuss difficult truths, more aware of their own failings. Constance continued her quiet philanthropy, focusing particularly on education. She donated books to enslaved people who could read, supported ministers who taught literacy in secret, and used her social position to advocate for small improvements in the treatment of household staff. It wasn't enough. She knew it would never be enough to atone for her complicity in the system, but it was something. The families that had been disrupted that summer recovered in various ways. Some marriages ended quietly, with wives sent away to live with relatives or husbands seeking solace in business ventures that kept them traveling. Some survived through willful forgetting, all parties agreeing never to speak of what had happened. A few even grew stronger, the crisis forcing couples to confront issues they'd been avoiding for years. Thomas Pendleton never fully recovered from his daughter's rebellion. Sarah remained in Marietta, building an independent life that scandalized her family. She eventually married a schoolteacher, a match far beneath her former station, and lived happily by all accounts. Pendleton drank increasingly, his business suffering, his reputation declining. He died 5 years later, and there were whispers that he'd taken his own life, though the official cause was listed as a fall from his horse. As for Gabriel, his fate became a matter of speculation and rumor. Some claimed he'd escaped during the transport to Mississippi and made his way north to freedom. Others said he died within a year, succumbing to disease or accident on the remote plantation. A few insisted he'd been sold again, passed from owner to owner, his unusual appearance continuing to cause disruption wherever he went. The truth, as documented in plantation records that surfaced decades later, was more mundane and more tragic. Gabriel had indeed arrived at the Mississippi plantation. He'd been housed alone, given work maintaining the property's extensive gardens, and lived in isolation as promised. He survived there for 11 years, aging into his mid-30s, before dying of a fever during an epidemic that swept through the region in 1861, just as the Civil War began. Among his few possessions was the book of sonnets Constance had given him, its pages worn from repeated reading. Tucked inside was a single sheet of paper on which he'd written his own thoughts, a kind of reflection on his life. The overseer who found it couldn't read well enough to understand its significance, and it was eventually lost. Though one phrase was reportedly copied into the estate records, "Beauty is a prison when the world cannot see past it to find the soul within." The official records of the summer of 1850 remain notably sparse. The newspapers that usually documented every social scandal stayed strangely quiet about the series of disruptions that rocked Atlanta's elite families. Church records from that period make veiled references to moral testing and trials of faith, but nothing specific. It's as if the entire city conspired to forget what had happened, to bury the truth under layers of silence and misdirection. But the legacy of those 8 months lingered in Atlanta long after Gabriel's departure. Families that had been disrupted never fully recovered their former closeness. Marriages that had survived showed permanent cracks. Women who'd been caught up in the collective obsession carried shame and confusion for years, unable to fully understand or explain their own behavior to themselves, let alone to others. Perhaps most significantly, the incident exposed uncomfortable truths about the structure of Southern society, the tensions between stated values and actual desires, the violence inherent in treating human beings as property, the psychological costs of maintaining social hierarchies built on repression and denial. For a brief moment, the mask had slipped, and everyone had glimpsed the chaos and contradiction underneath. In the end, Gabriel's crime was existing in the wrong body, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. His beauty became a mirror that reflected back all the contradictions and hypocrisies that Atlanta's elite wanted to keep hidden. He didn't seduce anyone, didn't encourage improper behavior, didn't transgress any social boundaries. He simply was. And that was enough to tear apart the carefully maintained fiction that everyone was content with their assigned roles. The most disturbing aspect of the entire affair was this: it could have happened to anyone who inadvertently challenged the social order just by existing. The system couldn't accommodate someone who was simultaneously human and property, visible and invisible, desirable and forbidden. When those contradictions became impossible to ignore, the system didn't change. It simply expelled the person who'd exposed them. And so Atlanta moved forward, its families rebuilding, its society reconstituting itself around the same fundamental structures that had created the crisis in the first place. The lessons that might have been learned were instead buried alongside the memories of that chaotic summer. Life returned to its careful rhythms, its prescribed roles, its comfortable illusions, but those who'd lived through it were forever changed, even if they could never quite articulate how or why. They carried within them the knowledge of their own capacity for irrationality, for obsession, for cruelty disguised as propriety. That knowledge was uncomfortable, so most chose to forget it, to convince themselves it had been an aberration rather than a revelation. Only a few, like Constance and Judge Hawthorne, allowed the experience to truly transform them. They spent the rest of their lives grappling with what it meant, what it revealed about themselves and their society. They never spoke of it publicly, but in private moments, they sometimes wondered what had become of Gabriel, whether he'd found any peace, whether he'd survived long enough to see the system that had tormented him begin to crumble. They would never know that he had died just as that system entered its death throes, never lived to see emancipation or the hope of a different future. Perhaps that was the final tragedy in a story full of them. That Gabriel never got to witness the beginning of the change that his existence had hinted might be possible. This mystery shows us that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones we keep from ourselves about who we are and what we truly desire beneath the mask of respectability. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Gabriel's beauty truly a curse, or was the curse in how society chose to react to it? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.